Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to FORTIFY. I'm Janine Mason. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego, and I'm pleased on behalf of our partner, the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego, to welcome you this afternoon. We have been waiting since Tuesday for this day to get to part 2 of Dare to Lead, and so I'm going to take some time to just very briefly go over some housekeeping to help you make the most of your time with us today. If you're having any technical difficulties, please email Cynthia or send her a message in the chat box. I want to let you know that everyone is muted today. We will entertain questions as we did on Tuesday. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you have resources that you'd like to share or request or that we refer to, you will find them in the chat box. I do also want to ask you to make sure that if you use chat, that you have it clicked for all participants. That way everybody can see what you're sharing. We'll stay on the call about 10 minutes later today to make sure that we have extended time to answer all of the questions that you have for Lorri. We are recording this webinar, and the recording and the resources will be added to both of our websites, and those addresses are at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura Dietrich.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura Dietrich, and I'm the Associate Director of the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. And thank you, Janine, for your wonderful partnership on this FORTIFY series. And thank you to all the nonprofit leaders who are joining us today. It is not easy to carve out time to develop yourself in the normal environment, working environment, and it's all the more difficult now. But the calls we hear for justice that we so clearly hear right now, I believe are accompanied by a deep longing for real and impactful leadership. So we want to uphold that, and we will continue at the Nonprofit Institute, and I know at the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego, to develop leaders. And we are so happy to be joined again by my friend and colleague, Dr. Lorri Sulpizio, to produce the second part of the Dare to Lead series. And I wanted just to point out that we're offering additional FORTIFY webinars coming up that you can look at, and we are also producing on June 10th Nonprofit Academy, where we'll have several. Lorri's going to be there again if you want to see more of her. It's free. It's open to anyone who wants to participate, and Cynthia will be putting a link to register for that. Even if you want to come for some or just part of the day, you're more than welcome to join us for that. So Lorri, without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Frank, I also heard that echo, but I'm hoping that now that we shifted speakers and everybody else is muted, it will be cleaner. So please let me know if you are having a hard time hearing, and I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared. We're going to pick up where we left off. So I want to do a quick recap for anybody who maybe is joining us new. But I'm assuming that everybody here was here with us on Tuesday. You know, we're talking about Brené Brown's Dare to Lead model that has identified 4 observable and measurable skill sets that define courageous and brave leadership. And the first of those skill sets is rumbling with vulnerability. And what we found is that at the core of all of the skill sets and at the core of effective leadership is essentially an ability to be vulnerable, have vulnerable cultures, and that every other skill set stems from the ability to tolerate and work with vulnerability. So I'm seeing, okay, good, they'll be recording, yes. So when we think about values, and we're going to talk about values today, and I think today's going to be a fun one because it's going to be webinar, but it is a webinar, but I'm going to do my best to try to make it interactive. And so I hope you have something to write with and something to write on kind of handy, because I want this to be where we roll up the sleeves and start doing some of the work. And then trust, braving trust and instilling trust is definitely vulnerable. To give your trust to people is a very, very vulnerable endeavor. And then the rising process is also vulnerable. So vulnerability is at its core, and we kind of ended here on Tuesday. So I want to come back to what gets in the way, especially in organizations, because we don't embrace a vulnerable culture because of these myths, right? There are 7 myths of vulnerability. So one is that in general, vulnerability is weakness. And, as the definition of vulnerability, sometimes we will use vulnerability to mean something that is weak. And what's really important is when we think about vulnerability from the definition of risk and emotional exposure, taking the risk of living wholeheartedly and authentically, that is vulnerable making, right? It does sort of put you in this sort of vulnerable place, but not a weak place. A lot of leaders, especially, I don't do vulnerability. I'm good. I've got it together. I kind of exist in my head. I'm well learned. So I don't do vulnerability. And the next one that goes with that is I can go it alone, right? I've got this. I've learned this early on. I can go it alone. We often think that we'll do vulnerability, but we'll do it without discomfort. So I'm going to bring some vulnerability into my team, but we're going to do it from a comfortable place. You can't do that. The other one is this idea of trust coming before vulnerability. So do I need to trust you before I am vulnerable with you? Do I need to trust you before I allow myself to be seen? Or is it allowing myself to be seen that develops the trust between us and among us, right? And it's yes, it's a both and. So I think it's really important that we are open and willing to offer and give trust and give of our authentic selves, because that is how cultures are created, these courageous cultures. Number 6 is kind of a fun one, because often people think vulnerability is disclosure. So I'm going to tell you all of my core wounds, all of my childhood traumas, all about sort of the pains, that I've had. And that's me being vulnerable. And that's just not it, right? And sometimes you might know people like that, where they are going to just sort of blurt out everything that you don't want to hear. And you're kind of that deer in headlights, like listening to this information, but it really isn't an engagement that's sort of truly seeing each other or engaging each other at that level. It is just sort of a barf of information. That's not vulnerability. And then finally, this idea that systemic vulnerability is the same thing as relational. So that is not true, right? We aren't talking about having water systems and IT systems and structures that are vulnerable. We're talking about relational vulnerability and our ability to be who we are and connect with others. So what I would like everybody to do right now is just think about these 7, and I want you to think about sort of the 1 or 2 of them that you think you most need to unlearn, right? What one do you need to unlearn in order to step into a more courageous model of leadership, practice of leadership? And let's just go ahead and put them all in the chat. I want to remind you, please make sure your chat says all panelists and attendees, so everybody gets it. But let's just see what we have, right? And this is a vulnerable act, right? So we are starting to try to live it as we are learning about it. Yeah, vulnerability as weakness is a tough one. I can go it alone for sure. Yep, I think when we see these, we can start to recognize them as they show up in our lives. And then we can start to see how they would probably get in the way, not just of our personal lives, but also in our ability to have truly kind of open, connected workplaces, right? And let's just imagine that I can go it alone, right? We know up here that none of us can do any of this alone. We can't do our work alone. We don't exist alone. Even if you are an independent contractor, you rely on others to get your work done. So it's kind of this is why it's a myth. It's this sort of funky paradox of thinking, oh, I can do things by myself and I'm going to try to exist that way, even though that's not the case. But that story that we tell ourselves, or that expectation to go it alone, really prevents us and gets in the way of us achieving our full potential, of being willing to ask for help, right? The other thing with that one that is really important is think about when you've been able to show up for somebody. Maybe it's a colleague at work, maybe it's a family member. If I were to say by a show of hands, how many people does it feel good to show up for somebody and know that you were able to truly be a help and a support in somebody's life? Yeah, thank you, right? It totally does. So here's the interesting thing, right, that we say is that vulnerability looks like courage in you but I see it as weakness in me, right? I am more than willing to show up and help you. Please ask me for help. But when you ask me how I'm doing, oh, I'm good. No, I got this, right? And we just have this barrier around our own selves and our willingness to display the courage, to display vulnerability, to ask for help, which we admire in others. And we want that of people. So we want to keep this in mind again, to do the work with others and to tell your team, ask for help. You don't have to, do it alone. We don't have to have trust. We can be vulnerable because we're going to hold each other in that. You've got to be willing to engage with that too. So kind of really important. And these myths are some that are ongoing and they kind of show up in different ways. So it's just this awareness of being able to work with them. Okay, so what's the practice then? If vulnerability is the core, before we get to values, how do we do it, right? First one, right? And this is all about being in the arena. Be you. Be willing to be seen. Be open to others, right? Be honest. And we can learn skills on how to speak with good boundaries and words that resonate so that they can be heard by our team and our colleagues. And then be clear. Clear is kind. Unclear is unkind, right? Be clear. My Tuesday presentation, or the Wednesday, whenever the Nonprofit Academy is going to be about leading in kind of times of uncertainty. And one of the biggest things, when people are uncertain and we don't know the way, it is hard for leaders to say, I don't have an answer for you, or the truth is we are going to have to furlough people, or we are going to make big cuts. People would rather know, right? Be clear, and then we can do the work that is required of us with the emotions that come up, right? But be you, be seen, practice that. And if we can embrace that in each other without judgment, then all of a sudden we will start to see a culture shift. And if we can be open, and if I can be honest, all of a sudden those hard conversations that are really going to move us forward will start to happen, right? We'll see them in meetings, we'll have them sort of in our interactions, and we won't shy away from those hard conversations that are really at the core of our work. This is really important, right? Feelings are data, feelings matter, feelings have an impact, right? I know that when in the workplace, we're data driven, we do surveys, we want numbers. We very much do that, kind of in the Nonprofit Institute. We do a lot of great research, and it's important to understand that feelings are also data, as valid as any other number crunching, and that feelings matter, right? And when we start to bring this kind of living and leading into our lives, feelings are going to surface. And that's what we want, right? That's what we want, because they are impacting us whether we are admitting them or not, right? If we're denying them, they're still there and they're still causing the impact. It's just probably a negative one. So just recognize that, can we start to shift our cultures to embrace the value of feelings, not only as data, but they matter to who we are as people. This is a big one, and this one comes up a lot when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and belonging work around white people and white privilege, which is let go of being right and focus on getting it right. It's hard for leaders to admit they don't know. It's hard for leaders to admit they're not right, because part of leadership is you've earned an expertise. You've displayed this sort of higher level, and you're the boss. You're the head. You're the ED. You're the CEO. And so probably because you've had a lot of years and success of being right, but the problem is when we start to anchor to being right, the higher we go, the more nuanced the situations we face are going to be. And if we're so forced and focused on being right, we're going to miss something. So instead, can we work on getting it right? I don't know this, but I really want to get it right. Can you help me understand? I don't have the answers, and so I can't think about the right way to move through this, but let's talk about all the options in front of us, right? So let go of being right, and let's work on the process of getting it right. It's in that getting that is the key. And here it is, right? Be willing to learn. Be willing to be wrong, right? It's very much related. And you'll start to see when we're wrong, right? When we're learning, there's going to be feelings. It's going to lead to hard conversations, right? So all this stuff is kind of happening simultaneously, and it is creating this culture of leadership behavior. Who you are is how you lead. I'll come back to that one that we talked about on Tuesday. Who you are is how you lead. Get to know yourself. Get to know your triggers. Get to know your strengths. Get to know the places that you aren't as strong, so you can bring people to fill in your gaps that will help you, that will be the one to kind of have their strengths kind of fills in where your strengths are not, and you can work well together, right? Part of the challenge with organizations is we often hire and fill our teams with people that are just like us because it's familiar, right? But then we're stuck then in the same thinking, the same patterns, the same knowing, and then we do make big mistakes, right? And we don't have the diversity of thought, of vision, of strategy as we could if we got to know ourselves and then filled in the gaps with all this diverse type of people. So that's a big part of it as well. Okay, this is really important as we move forward, right? And I think part of this work has to do with this line of acknowledging the story I'm telling myself, right? The story I'm making up is the story I'm telling myself about this. And here's the thing. In the absence of data, we are wired to fill in the blanks. We are wired to have meaning making and sense making for a calming, a stress reduction technique. So we don't like to sit in the not knowing. We create a story, right? I mean, think of a silly example. You text somebody. I mean, this is probably all too common. You can raise your hand if this resonates with you. You send a text and maybe it's, you know, it's a significant text of some kind, and or you're inviting people out or something, and you see the bubbles, right? You see the 3 bubbles that somebody was going to say something, and then there's no text that comes. All of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, what is it? Are they not going to respond to me? Right? Like, what did I say? Oh, they're mad. Oh, they read it. Now they put it down. Oh, I knew they didn't want to, you know, I knew I wasn't as important. We fill our heads with all these stories. And the problem is that usually these stories are full of self-doubt and they don't reflect our own self positively. Right? So checking the stories is really, really important. And that in and of itself is an act of courage, right? So start paying attention to the ways that you fill in the blank with stories and what those stories are like. And are there patterns to those? Do those stories kind of privilege a certain way of being, or do they always put you down, or do they always put a particular group down? Like, let's start to understand those stories so that we can get to a more sort of courageous and authentic and open workplace and environment. Okay, so one of the things that we talk about, and values are going to be part of it, is this idea to rumble with vulnerability, right? And a rumble is only a conversation that anchors to what is there, what I'm feeling, and what the story is, right? So we'll talk about some examples after we do the value work, but really a rumble is saying, you know, Laura's my colleague, right? And so we're in a meeting and I went to say something and she, you know, kind of immediately picked up her phone and it felt like she wasn't paying attention to me. And so I could say like, oh, I knew it, you know, Laura doesn't value my work. And I knew it. I knew she doesn't pay attention whenever I want to say something. And so I've got this kind of story, but I know that's not healthy. And I know that's not good for our working relationship. So I may go to her and say, hey, Laura, here's I know I want to rumble. Do you have a second? When I started to talk about the new program I wanted to launch and you picked up your phone and started texting, it really made me feel like you don't care and you are already going to vote it down. Is that true? Like, what's up with that? Then it gives her a chance to answer, right? Now I'm really saying, this is what it felt like to me. It made me feel like you don't care about this new program I'm really passionate about. And I feel a little disrespected and dismissed. And she might say, well, you know what, Lori, I told you we weren't going to launch that. So yes, I was frustrated with you. So I picked up my phone because I knew I would snap. So now we can have that conversation. Or she could say, oh my God, no, my dog ate something bad. He's been sick all morning. He's at home with my daughter and I'm just trying to check on him because she needs to give him the next dose of medicine. Oh my gosh, how's your dog? That happened to my dog. You see what I mean? So 2 very different situations. One is relatively benign where I can be like, phew, thank goodness, right? You weren't dismissing me. How's your dog? Or the other one allows for us to have that real conversation about our work where I did something that maybe Laura thought we had already talked about not doing. So then we can engage around that. But that's a rumble, right? The rumble is, I'm going to take a risk. This is vulnerable, but I want to be truly seen because our relationship and our work is important. Right? And the vulnerability risk is that there's uncertainty. I don't know what Laura's going to say, right? I don't know how I'm going to feel after she responds. It's a little risky, right? It's a risk. If she shoots down my program, that feels like a risk. If I stay quiet, maybe I can keep it under the radar. And it's emotionally exposed. For me to share that I feel dismissed, I mean, that's sharing that, you know, my feelings were hurt. So there is some emotional exposure there. So that's the idea of a rumble. And I understand they're not acceptable. I think the idea with this work and trying to train people, from you all to us working with high-level CEOs and executives and college presidents and political officials, is to try to make this more acceptable, right? But I totally get it. And I would say then, I would explore in the workplace you're talking about where it's not acceptable, is there a way to raise the issue that, hey, can we have more open conversations? I feel like we might be better and more productive if we could share more openly with each other, right? And maybe not. Maybe they're going to say, oh, you know, Manoush, come on, just get to work. We don't have time for that. Or maybe there'll be one or two folks that are willing to say like, yeah, that would be great. Let's try it. You know, it is hard to say, and each individual organization kind of is its own unique situation. But hopefully more and more, as more and more leaders and people get trained in this work, there's going to be that kind of critical mass to make a tipping point, right? And even, for example, we're seeing on a wide scale with the social tension that we need to have more real conversations, you know, on a social level. And so regardless of where you fall around any of the stuff that's happened over the last week, I think what we're seeing is we need learning, we need unlearning, we need understanding, and we need conversations, right? And I think the fact that we see the impact and the consequence of not being willing to do that, right? And then where people get sort of pushed to, and then the protests, and it's asking for kind of change, right? And get change, it's conversation. So hopefully we're seeing a small shift, but I do hear you. I want to acknowledge that I get it. And I, you know, even personally, I get it, you know, and even in our workplaces and stuff, there are some people that we know just aren't open to this, and it's hard. It makes it hard, right? But hopefully you can find enough people that would be open to this, that you can continue to expand your capacity to do this work and to lead this way. But I definitely appreciate the comment. Okay. So it's really, really important, right? That the first step, rumbling with vulnerability. And I think I mentioned on Tuesday, in the Big Dare to Lead training, we would spend another 6 hours digging into shame and recognizing shame triggers, and when we get into our shame storms and everything, but we're not going to do that today. I hope at least the case is made for what vulnerability is, that kind of uncertainty, risk, and emotional and exposure, and why it is critical for effective leadership, right? Why allowing the range of feelings from uncertainty to joy leads to things like creativity, connection, innovation, accountability, right? So hopefully that has been, a case has been made for that. So knowing what's important, right? Values, I think they're one of my most favorite things to work on and work with, because I feel like it is the best, lowest hanging fruit to make a fast impact, right? To make an impact right away. Because really everybody would say, that they have values, right? And every organization has its values. Now, one of the things that we found going into organizations is that values often are posters, you know, on the wall, you know, the big eagle that says integrity, the little cat hanging on the branch, perseverance, right? That's really irritating. I think those kind of value posters, they're irritating because what we found is that they're meaningless. Right? They feel good maybe, and they give this false sense of, oh, we're living with integrity because we've got values all over. But very few organizations and teams really have operationalized their values in a way that gets behavioral and allows them to hold themselves accountable to those values, right? So what we're going to do is think about, how do we know what's important? It is our values, right? And living into our values allows us to identify the driving behaviors and ideas, right, that are most important to our work. We can then operationalize them and turn them into behaviors. And then we can create this consistent culture that will allow us to live our values out. This then paves the way for these hard conversations when our values are out of alignment. Right? So it's kind of providing the landscape to start being accountable and start having conversations. So when we identify values and operationalize them, now all of a sudden we have some content to talk about, right? That is, everybody agrees on. We can do the values, exercise as a team. We all kind of agree on these 3 values. And now we know how we want to live them out. So we can now agree to hold ourselves accountable when we see that we're slipping from them, right? So it's kind of a nice boundaried way that invites conversation and invites accountability. So it might be a little hard to read, and some of you have probably done, I'm guessing at some point in your work, you've done values work. So usually, again, we take a little bit longer with this, but I want you to find, this says top 3, pick 2, right? And I just put this list in case you don't kind of off the top of your head know your values. Ideally, everybody knows their top 3 values, like right away. Right away, top 3 values. So if you don't, though, no worries if you haven't done this exercise in a while, and values do change. Here's a list, and maybe this will spur some thought, or you'll be like, oh yeah, intelligence is a value, or balance is a value. But get your 2 values down and just write them on a piece of paper. I'm going to give you kind of just a few seconds to do that. And if you're struggling with, I have 5 look good, right? Just pick 2 that you think would be in your top 10 to work with for today. Okay, we can certainly do, a more extensive exercise at another time, but at least pick 2 to work with. I often get the question, hey, Lorri, are these my personal values or my work values, right? What do you think the answer is? Anybody have an answer right off the bat that knows and can put it in the chat? What's the answer to that? Are these your personal values or your work values? What do you think? Yes, ding, 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 winners. I know, I'm sorry, it's hard to read, Deb. It's it's like a PDF that I just put on there, so I apologize for that. But hopefully, just some values you have to work with. They should be the same, right? They should be the same. We do show up differently in our role at work, right? So my role as a mother in this home is very different than my role as a director for the Conscious Leadership Academy, which is slightly different than my role as professor when I'm going to teach a course. But my values, my core values should be the same, right? And that's really, really important. When people start to think about, well, I'm this here and I'm that there, then we need to look at that, right? What about your work is pulling you away from your true self, or vice versa, right? So that would be something. So it should be the same. Good answer. Okay. So now I want you to take your values, you should have 2 of them, and I want you to create an action-oriented definition. It should be specific and it should be behavioral. So for example, if one of our values are respect, we might decide that what respect looks like in action is we talk to people, not about people, right? That is concrete, it's behavioral, it's specific, right? If we're going to say as a company we value wellness, then the concrete value, the operationalized definition would be we take 45 minutes in that lunchtime hour that are meetings free for people to be encouraged to get outside, to take a walk, to meditate, to do whatever they need to do for themselves. It is kind of the dead 45 minutes because we value wellness and we're going to live it out, right? Courage, right? So courage, and all these are tough, right? Because they're kind of abstract words: courage, respect, trust, truth, right? Courage, we stay in meetings to address the hard things and we hear from all voices, right? The specific part is we hear from all voices. Nobody gets to leave my meetings without speaking, right? You're all on this team. You are all valuable members of this team. You're all going to speak and say something, right? So that is how we practice courage. Again, that's definitions that some people adapt. Your definitions can be relevant to your company, your industry, your team, the context. If you picked a personal value, go ahead and define it. I think I might have mentioned family before, right? So if my value is family, easy to say, what does it look like, right? What does family look like lived out in my life? That's how I need to define it so that I know if I am aligned with it or not. Does that make sense? So I'm going to give you about another minute or so, and I want everybody to get a behavior. It can be short and sweet. If you have any questions or if you feel stuck, please ask. If you have one that you'd be willing to put in the chat as an example to others, that would be great. Feel free to please put one of your values and the definition in the chat. We can start. It's often helpful to see the way different people operationalize different values. I give everybody about another 90 seconds or so to 2 minutes. Great. There's one that says integrity. We communicate honestly without deception. Right? That's great. Adaptability, be willing to change and open to learning something new. Great. So Frank, that's great. I'm going to kind of expand that a bit and say adaptability, we learn something new every week. Right? That's really getting specific. That's in a way that we can hold ourselves accountable, because come Friday at our end meeting, I could say, okay, team, what did we learn that was new? Right? What did we learn new this week? Right? What learning did we have? And then we can have that conversation. Right? So again, really great example. And it's that work to fine tune it and make it very specific, almost measurable, essentially. Right? Generosity. Yes, generosity for Rachel looks like 10 hours a week of volunteer time. That's so great, because then at the end of that week, did you do it? Did you not? How close to your value were you? Perfection. Ooh, that's a hard one. Perfection. I try hard to develop lessons that are easy to understand and deliver without me there. I think about the little things. That's great, right? So we consider the little details in all that we do, right? That's great. Good. These are wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for sharing that. That's the way. And again, really think to yourself with your examples at the end of a week, at the end of a month, whatever your time frame would be, could you then use your definition to look at your value and say, I did that well, or, oh, I didn't do that as well, right? It really needs to be behavioral. That is a critical part, especially for accountability, right? When it's behavioral, we can then talk to each other and say, our behaviors are off, okay? Any questions before I go on? Does anybody have any ideas or thoughts or reflections on how you see values in your workplace? And if you've tried to operationalize them or not?
So, Lorri, we have one question that's a little bit long. I'm going to read it to you. It's from Colleen. It says, at a former workplace, I led with vulnerability, masked as being a brassy New Yorker who said what I felt needed to be said and addressed the elephant in the room. My colleagues responded to it and appreciated my honesty. My management did not respond well. Is there a way to bring this up with potential employers to see if the practice of leading with vulnerability is accepted or respected?
That's a great question. And I think absolutely, if you are kind of in the job market, you want to find a culture that fits. I mean, I think we often spend a lot of time thinking about, when we're in high school, going to college, trying to find a college that fits big, in a big town, little town, big school, little school, liberal arts, research institution, right? Like you want to fit, you want to go to the campus and really have it, feel right. And somehow with jobs, we kind of lose that sort of discretion. And I think that I understand it's sort of maybe a desire, like I have to have a job. I mean, right? Like I'm going to take this job and say yes to it. It's a paycheck. But we do then get into cultures and organizations that aren't aligned with sort of who we are and who we want to be and the work we want to do. So I think that what I would suggest is if you are in the workplace, openly ask, I really value kind of a culture that kind of exists with openness and honesty, where we can have the hard questions and hold each other accountable. Do you see this company doing that, right? If you feel comfortable asking that in an interview, when they say, do you have any questions for us? I think that's a great question. If you get a chance to talk to other people, right, depending on kind of the application process, and if you're allowed to talk to other employees to get a feel for it, I would ask them, what's it like here really? You know, how do you all really deal with this? And I think it's a hard call, because one thing to be curious about is the way we bring up the issues and the way that we address the elephant in the room. And there is a skill, right, to being able to frame it and bring it up in a way that is hearable, right? We want it to be heard. Sometimes we can push things and timing might be off or whatever it might be, where our message gets lost. So there is an art, right? There's an art and science to delivering a message that's going to get heard, especially if that message starts to kind of ping on the fabric of people's own values and their emotions. So it's a great question. And I would say, yes, I would encourage you to try to make sure that company or organization is going to do that, because that's what you want to be able to do, right? That's great. That's a good question. Thank you. Okay, so no other questions about it. Great, so we're going to continue. All right, so now what I want you to do is I want you to take your values, and this is a really fun exercise, I think, to do with your employees and to do with your spouse even, or to do with your team. Take your values, and if you wrote more, if you can think of others, right? If you have 2 for sure, and I want you to rank them. I want you to look at your definition and think of your definition. I want you to rank them based on how well they are being reflected in your life, okay? Meaning, if wellness is a value and we have this 12:15 to 1 o'clock dead time, but over the last month or two in this chaos, we have scheduled meetings whenever, because people have just kind of been in flux, and we've taken meetings when we can get them. I would have to rank wellness lower, right? I might rank it a 4 in this moment. Does that make sense? So where if we have held to that time because we don't compromise on that, I could say, yeah, it's a 9. You know, I pretty much honor that, except for the 2 times I actually had to be on a call at lunch. I had a lunchtime call or something like that, right? So think about your values that you wrote, and I want you to write how well they are reflected in your life. 10 means fully lived out, 1 being not at all, right? And no judgment on ourselves. This is where we start to get honest with ourselves, and we start to get the data that helps us figure out what shifts we need to make and where we need to start the growth and development of our leadership culture. Okay? So I give you a little bit of time. And then in the chat, if you could, I want to see, just kind of throw, you don't have to put your value, if you're willing, because this is vulnerable too, to admit that you have a 3 could feel vulnerable. So if you're comfortable and willing, go ahead and throw your numbers down there. What numbers do we have? And in this time right now, right, it's a time where we need to give ourselves some grace and gratitude, because it is a very interesting, unnerving time. Okay, we got a 4. Great. The others have their value numbers. From a scale of 1 to 10, how well are you living out those values? Yeah, I can understand something being a 5 right now, and a 6, a 4, a lot of 8s. Great. So what we want to think about is this gap, right? Minding the gap between where we are and where we want to be. Okay, and our values can be a really good clue to helping us mind that gap. So that space between, right? I would like to be a 9. I often don't expect a 10 out of myself personally, because you know, my life is so full and crazy that I think if I can be getting an 8.5 or 9, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good about myself. But if I get to a 6-ish, even a 7-ish, for sure a 5, I start to try to reflect and figure out what's going on, right? So if you are an 8 though, or an 8 or 9, still just think about that 1 little point difference. And what is in that space between, right? What shifts might you need to make to lessen that gap and bring that number up, right? Is it a shift in action? Do you need to do something differently? Is it a shift in mindset? Do you need to think about something differently? Do you need to give yourself permission, perhaps? Do you need to, for faith, perhaps, do you need to give yourself the actual time to sort of read scripture or spend time in prayer or spend time, in some sort of faith-based activity that would bring you more in touch with that value? What might it be? And just write a note to yourself. Write a little note to yourself about that. So one of the things that we do with this work is say, okay, I'm starting to get some identifiable data about the gap. So I'm I'm understanding that gap, I usually exercise at noon and I've gotten all these meetings scheduled and I'm not in control of my calendar right now. So God, that slipped away. Or, sleep is part of my wellness value, and I just haven't been sleeping well because I've been stressed, and I stay up, starting reading the news and looking at Facebook and Twitter, and I just all of a sudden it's 2 a.m. So you start to get a sense, right, of sort of what is there. And then you can figure out, so what do I need to do, right? What might I need to do to shift? What might get in my way? Right? This is a really important question. What's going to get in my way of making this shift? And then the next question would be, who's going to help me and hold me accountable? How am I going to get the help I need to do this shift? And who's going to hold me accountable, or how am I going to hold myself accountable? So imagine this in the context of your work done with your team, right? A team that says, hey, it looks like we've sort of drifted a little bit from our values, from this particular value. Let's talk about that, right? Let's try to understand that gap a bit, and you can brainstorm about the gap and what are we doing now instead? What's getting in the way? What do we find ourselves? What's hard about that value, right? And then we can say, well, what do we need to do? What do we need to do to get back to that value? And then we can ask ourselves and brainstorm, okay, team, what barriers are we going to face? What's going to get in our way, right? And how are we going to be accountable, and who's going to help us? So you can see how this is really concrete. It's very specific, kind of action-oriented work and an exercise that can start to craft on our teams and in our organizations shared importance, right? What's shared, what we agree is important in terms of our values, what we agree upon we all want to do, right? So we're all agreeing on these behaviors. And then we're all agreeing that, wow, we've gone away from them. So we're going to have this conversation. So you can see how just using values is a great way to start the process of getting that shared culture and that space and context with which to talk and engage. But here's the thing also that we have to think about with values. And it's important this is why it's important to be attentive to values on an ongoing basis, right? Values isn't ever a one and done. In fact, I'm sure if we can all think my values at 22, not much like my values now, right? And it shouldn't have been, right? I mean, my values at 22, was very different, right? I mean, kind of learning about the world. I was protesting all over, deep in my feminist self, right? Kind of figuring out who I was, who the world was, trying to make a big difference that way. Now I have 4 children. So the values are going to shift, right? And definitely as life changes, our values change. So it's important. And with your company, as your company grows, as the organization maybe shifts its focus on who the stakeholders are, as your funding changes, your values might shift, right? So it's important to continue to be willing to do this work and examine with awareness what our values are. But then here's the thing, right? If we notice a gap, this is the big question. This is where we get honest with ourselves. We either need to make changes in our lives, which we talked about, right? Making changes in terms of what the shift is, or we might need to admit that what once was important is no longer as important. Okay, really, really critical. And that's hard, right? The biggest way a great example I think to show this is when I do this work a lot with women who are also mothers, and them being willing to take family off of their top 3. Because the social expectation and pressure for a woman who has children to have family as a top priority is so great that inevitably everybody does, right? All inevitably. But once we start to talk about it, then women realize, like, yeah, man, family is incredibly important. And things like connection and faith and truth would be my top 3, actually, right? Because that's more about me. So giving ourselves permission to do that is really, really critical. And it allows us to say, gosh, right now, health isn't as important. Right now, getting my team through this crisis is going to trump everything. I don't even like using that word actually anymore. Getting my team through this crisis is going to take priority. And so I know that means I'm not going to get my workouts in as much. I know that means I'm going to have a few later nights, but my team needs me. So for this 2-3 months, I'm going to have to let that fitness health value go down to a 4, right? It's going to have to shape shift a little bit. And I'm okay with that, right? Now, if that is ongoing for a year, I might need to really look and say, okay, fitness not as important anymore. Yeah, that was in my college athlete days. I'm good, right? I have a different value. So doing that work and being open and honest really helps us stay in alignment, right? Kind of live the life of integrity and lead with integrity because we have clarity, right? We have clarity of what's important and we have clarity of how we want to live out those important elements, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions with that? I'm not seeing any, so I'm assuming not. Oh, Deb, go ahead. I see Deb with a hand, or actually type it, I think, right? Because we're not speaking. So can you, I'll pause for a moment if you want to, if you're able to type a question. I think that's how we're going to do it.
That's how we're going to do it unless Cynthia wants to.
Oh, she was giving a thumbs up.
A thumbs up.
Okay. Perfect. Thumbs up right back. Okay, great.
Thanks, Deb.
Thank you, Deb. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so accountability. Let's talk a little bit specifically about this, right? I mean, this is an idea that if everybody can agree, right? If we all say like, hey, we agree on this value and this behavior, then yeah, you can hold me accountable to it, right? So it's almost like when you do this with your team and everybody signs up on it, even maybe signs on a piece of paper. Here's our values. Let's do a cool piece of paper. Let's frame it and put it up, right? Now we're giving each other permission to hold ourselves accountable, now by acknowledging like, oh yeah, we talk to people, not about people. We talk to each other. When I go to the break room and pour a cup of coffee and start saying something, you're going to say, hey, Lorri, no, we don't do that. Do we need to go and have this conversation, or do you just need to go take a walk and reflect? Because we don't talk about each other that way. It's like, yeah, you're right. Or I might say like, yeah, I'm pissed. Let's go. Can you come with me? I really want to have this conversation. I'm angry. So then it frees us up to work with what's there. It frees us up to be accountable, and it frees us up to then kind of drive our behaviors in the way that we want them, hopefully, to be driven. So let's talk through this a little bit with some examples, right? And maybe if you can think of any examples that you have, it'd be great to share from any of your work experiences or your teams or situations. So here's the thing, right? You're entitled to feel frustrated, right? This is how a leader, we can have this conversation, right? You're entitled to feel frustrated. Absolutely. We value emotion and we know they exist, but you are not allowed to roll your eyes, cross your hands, and check out of this meeting by looking at your phone. That's not allowed, right? So do you want to tell me what you're frustrated about? Right? And then somebody's going to say, no, I got it. Whatever. I get it. I won't. Fine. No rolling my eyes. Okay. Don't know when they leave. Happens again, right? The end of the week, next week, the same meeting. This has happened twice, right? You are entitled to be frustrated. I sense your frustration. We need to talk about this because the behavior in that meeting is not what we do. That's not aligned with our culture. It's not how we engage with each other. It certainly isn't productive and connecting. Whatever. Fine. I get it. I won't do it again. And at this point as a leader, you can say, you know what, this is time too, right? you're not going to do it again because we are going to sit here until you tell me what's up. Because either you tell me what's up and we get to the bottom of this, or it makes me think that you're really not a fit right now and there's something bigger going on. And then they might say, gosh, you know what, I'm just so frustrated because every time, you know, we get the information at the very end and then they expect us to turn it around by Monday. It's Friday. How is my team supposed to turn this around by Monday? And they drop this on us every time. Now I can work with that, right? Thank you for sharing. Yes, that's frustrating. Now I can work with you and we can work with the team, right? So again, being able to get behavioral and identify the behaviors that we don't want will help us understand when then something is underneath that is getting in our way. And then we can do the work, right? We can have that courageous conversation to do the work to clear the air and to figure out, of course your team needs more than, you know, a weekend. We don't work on weekends. We try not to. So that's not okay. I'm going to make sure you get it by Tuesday, right? So then I can do my part as the leader to sort of shift and help that situation, right? Another example is, and I use this one, you know, kind of this story with, say, Laura and I in a meeting. Like when you sighed and raised your arms as we were walking out of that meeting, it really made me think you were upset with me. So what I did there is I got in touch with the story I was telling myself, right? And then I went to check it out because that's what we do, because we're open, because I don't want to sit with resentment, right? Because I respect my colleagues and I respect our work at their core. And if there is something kind of getting in the way, I want to be the one to sort of raise it and clear the air or learn, right? Maybe there is something that, you know, they're upset with me about that I need to know so I can be better, right? So all of these situations, I mean, they may feel like the real world doesn't work that way, right? Perhaps the whole world doesn't always work that way, but I can promise you there are more and more people starting to exist this way, right? There are more and more folks learning to frame, you know, kind of conversations and begin engagements in ways that I'm going to own my story. I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from, and I'm coming with curiosity. So I'm not coming to judge and say, you always do that. You always roll your eyes like you're such a jerk whenever she's talking. Like, I don't come at it that way. I say, wow, you rolled your eyes again. It makes us feel dismissed, right? And when we feel dismissed, it makes us not want to work together. So what can we do about this? What's the eye roll about? So I'm curious. I've given a chance to kind of share my story, and then I give people a chance to write back and to answer me back, right? And it's a really important engagement. Let me see this question right here. Will it work? Many people are not naturally cooperative, intentional, honest, or open. Yeah, and that's the piece. This is a culture shift, right? This is a leadership practice. It is not like one quick skill set. It is 4 skill sets that have expansive kind of, you know, layers underneath them. And so I think the key is it does work, right? We know it works. Research is showing that it works. There's more and more work around emotional intelligence, owning our stories, being vulnerable, not just with Brené Brown, but with other folks as well. And we're starting to see it not just in our organizations, but we're seeing it in the world, right? We're seeing it in our social systems, and we're seeing a need for something different. We're seeing a need for more open, raw conversations that acknowledge the hard. You know, we're being asked and forced to sit in truths that are very difficult and that are that messy middle, but we have to do that, right? So we are starting to see that this model can help us through those things. And yes, you know, more people wanting to work this way. Maybe there's a few of you, maybe you know, a small critical mass within your organization starts to do this, and it takes hold. Right? And it takes hold, and a little bit by little bit, the culture starts to shift, but it is challenging. And I know it's not traditional business culture, but that's why I love nonprofit, education, you know, women leaders, leaders of color, because those folks are certainly willing. We are pushing hard on the door of that corporate kind of still straight white male, you know, Christian world to try to shift that. It's not easy, right? Not easy. However, I think it's worth the try, right? And there's enough of us, I think, saying we are hopeful enough that this will start to create a tipping point. I see a question here. Let's see. Not in higher leadership positions. How do we shift work? We're leading from the middle. Great question. So the first thing would be kind of what relationship do you have with your boss? You know, do you have a good relationship with your boss, and can you start to create conversations there? You know, are you in a place where your boss is open, where your boss starts to value learning for you, for others? Are you at a place where you can make a difference in meetings, where you might be able to get some allies, right? And if you can find allies, even laterally, right, kind of to the left and right of you, enough of you might be able to start this and start talking this way, where it again starts to take hold. If you're in the middle and you still have some authority within that middle and you run meetings, you can bring this to your own small circle. And again, it could become that critical mass. So it is challenging, but I think it'd be important to start with sort of relationship with your boss, relationship with other higher ups, relationships laterally, and can you start to create some allyship around this kind of work with those who are willing to do it with you? That's what I would say. Okay, Deb, let me read you. I have a hard time responding to that behavior unless I see a pattern or it's affecting others because it feels enabling. I don't fully know what behavior you're referring to. Is there a particular behavior that you're referring to, Deb? Is it just maybe like is it the roll the eyes behavior? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, but that's the part though, right? This is the interesting part. It does affect others, but it feels like a small ripple. It feels like a small, kind of little wrinkle, but enough little wrinkles, eventually you hold up that garment and it's going to be a kind of total wrinkled, unwearable mess. So I think part of it is, eye rolling, we know, kind of everyone's been in any kind of couple therapy, you don't eye roll. I mean, right? Eye roll is dismissive. And we want to catch ourselves, because we don't want to do that with our colleagues that we really want to have close working relationships with, right? So I think we do start calling out those little things, because if we start to create the space where we can call out those little things, maybe we can then start calling each other and ourselves on those bigger things, right? That would be really important as well. I know we're getting close to time, so I kind of want to just finish kind of going back to the 4 skill sets, right? Rumbling with vulnerability, we talked about. There is none of these other 3 are going to happen if you aren't okay with rumbling with vulnerability. And rumbling with vulnerability is a lifelong thing, because our shame and our triggers, they come up ongoing. We get good, and then we get a fallback. I mean, right? We meet somebody new that triggers us in a new way, a new hire, a new this, whatever it might be. We are constantly needing to learn to rumble with vulnerability. Values, right? It tells us what's important. Tells us a lot of what's important, and it can guide us. So I would say a great place to start, if you do want to bring this kind of work to your team, to your organization, start with values. Simple question right now in this time of COVID and tension, have our values shifted? Do we want to shift our values? Because if so, let's do something about that now, right? Trust is the next one. Once you start doing these 2 first things, then we start to brave trust and develop that, which then allows for us to hold each other accountable and allows for vulnerability. And then finally, when we live this way, we're going to get knocked down. We are going to get knocked down. So we need to learn how to rise. And a big part of rising is get in touch with the story you're telling yourself so you can check that story out. So I thank you so much for your time. I know I threw a lot at you, I think. And so I appreciate you hanging in there, and I appreciate your willingness to kind of do the work while we are going through the presentation. And I hope you all got a chance to work with your own values a little bit, and that it was useful. And if there's any questions, we can certainly take some now.
Lorri, one question that I have for all of us is, if we're interested in continuing to learn about the 4 skill sets, do you have recommendations of books or materials or other ways that we could do that on our own or with our organization?
Absolutely. So kind of on your own, I'd read Dare to Lead. Dare to Lead is a great resource, and the book itself really unpacks all of this stuff. On the Dare to Lead website also does have some free resources and downloads, even simple things like posters you can start putting up that start to express some of these ideas. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Real leaders don't shy away from hard things. Just reminders like, oh yeah, this is how we want to lead. So the Dare to Lead book and the website is an incredible resource. I think I mentioned Brené has a podcast right now, Unlocking Us, and it is very good because she started it right when COVID started. So every speaker, every person is very situational and relevant to existing and leading now in this time. So that is a great way. And then if you're able and interested and your organization is interested, I mean, there is the full training. And that's always a little bit more of a formal way, but that can be done within an organization. We also host kind of registration-based workshops on the full training as well. So that would be kind of the first few quick and easy steps.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to leave that open for just a moment in case you have questions that you'd like to ask. Oh, one just popped up.
Yep.
Okay, let's see. If one leads asking for transparency, it can be incredibly time-consuming to address or even be misused as an excuse to work getting done. How do you handle this? Set time limits on conversations. I want to be sensitive to feelings.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And boundaries exist with all of this, right? So even with transparency, we have boundaries, right? And sometimes a leader can't share information, and a team just has to be okay with that. Sometimes a leader has to say, you know what, I want to continue this conversation, but I have a deadline and I need to get it done. So it's going to have to be tabled to next week. The hope would be that if there is the trust already built, that answer would be okay for me, because I trust that you aren't keeping me out of the loop for some agenda, right? Some kind of ulterior motive, but you truly, I believe that you've got to get something done. I believe that you have to go to another meeting and this conversation has to have a time boundary. So I think the idea with transparency is we do want to be open, but we also want to be very clear that there are some things, sometimes legally and sometimes because they're not able to be shared, strategically, that people just have to understand it can't be shared. So that would be what I would say, right? Be sure to have boundaries and protect yourself in that. And then, create that culture of trust so that when you do impose a boundary, it's accepted, right? And there's trust and like, okay, we'll come back to that. I know you're going to come back to that for me. I trust you. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Okay, great. I'm going to do a little bit of a transition here. We have another question.
Okay.
I'm going to transition us from officially ending the webinar to going to after hours.
Okay.
We'll take care of all the questions, so nobody worry, but thank you all for joining us. And I want to remind you that FORTIFY is off next week. USD and the Nonprofit Institute has another big training that they're doing next week, and so we will not be on air, if you will. We return on Tuesday, June 16th, again for a two-part process that will be led by Lynn Corbett on adaptive leadership. So the registration information is on our website, both at Fieldstone and at the Nonprofit Institute, and so we hope you will join us for that as well. So with that, if you need to leave because you've hit a time boundary, thank you for joining us. And if you're able to stay, we'll continue with questions. So Lorri, the next question is, how do you handle compassion fatigue when in a space where your team works well? How do you take a break from the team without being rude?
It's a great question. I was in a MPEAK training, which is mindfulness for peak performance training through the UCSD Center for Mindfulness. And it's focused on kind of high performers and athletes and high level leaders and such, those who are performing, and how to be kind of use mindfulness as a way to perform. And one of the distinctions that was made there is the difference between empathy fatigue and compassion fatigue. And the definition that was given, I thought was very powerful, is that empathy is this, I'm going to feel with you. I'm going to feel what you feel. So if you're feeling fear, I'm going to get in touch with that. And that is draining, right? That is really draining. Compassion, on the other hand, is I'm going to offer love. I'm going to offer you grace and love. And we have an abundance of compassion. So I think to the answer your question is, the difference would be, hopefully we don't get to compassion fatigue because we can offer our love, we have a surplus of love. If we're starting to have empathy fatigue, we might be taking on more than we need to, and we do then need to have some boundaries. And it is perfectly okay to tell somebody, I really want to hear you, but I just can't right now. I'm a bit lost in my own storm, and I'm going to have to just take this time. Can I refer you, or how can I maybe help you find somebody else to talk to, because it just can't be me. And we need to be able to do that unapologetically, right? We need to be able to do that without feeling guilty, and to recognize kind of that place where we are over sort of empathizing in each other's fears and sorrows versus extending grace and love, but kind of expecting everybody to do their own work, right? It is not on my colleagues to take care of me. That's not their responsibility. I would like them to support me and be there for me, but take care of me is not it. I need to take care of myself. So we can have those conversations and build up our employees to know, like, you need to take some time right now because you're really pulling on this team. So I'm going to give you the gift of 2 days off. Take some time, self-care, because it's, you're draining. The energy is becoming unproductive for the rest of the team right now. And I think that's a great boundary. It's very loving, and it still extends compassion without overextending your capacity, if that makes sense. That's a great question.
All right. And with your answer, I think we've wrapped it up.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
So,
that was fun. I enjoyed the time.
That was fun and just enlightening and such a good reminder. I feel like personally, I've read the book, I've been through some of this training, but every time I learn something new, it's nuanced. You have an opportunity to just continue to evolve, because this is a practice, right? So you understand the skill, and then you continue to evolve as a practice. So thanks to all of you for joining us. Look forward to seeing many of you, if not all of you, on June 16th. And my thanks to Lorri on behalf of the Nonprofit Institute and Fieldstone. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your own grace and your own love and leadership with all of us in the sector.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all so much, and have a great weekend.